The Shadow of Death, King Cobra. Chapter 2, Uncertain Chaos. Jing sat on the ground outside the mine caves. He watched as the crows pecked on the new bodies the guards had hung up for them to feed on. 2 of the 4 bodies were old men. Both died fighting each other deeper in the mines. The 3rd one was a woman, and from where Jing sat, she looked a lot like Chen, his mother and his savior for 14 years. The 4th body was of a girl no older than Jing. She was beaten to death by the guards when she tried to fight their advances. Jing realized once more that lives meant so little in the great Bonanza mines, and the people were mere tools for those who funded this place. Jing was still there when he heard the familiar sound of boots. For years, the same sound had terrified him and was the reason behind countless nightmares, but not anymore. When those boots connected with his back and sent him rolling on the ground, Jing didn't let out a sound. He didn't even fight back. It wasn't because Jing couldn't fight. It was because Fulongquai had told him not to. He told him to keep the powers he possessed on a leash, to not let the Cobra take over his consciousness, that it was too soon for him to use the strength of the Cobra, and if he did, the guards wouldn't hesitate to put a bullet in his head, or a whole magazine for that matter.
"Get to work, boy,"
the guard shouted, hitting his back with the butt of his gun. Jing clenched his jaw and choked on the scream that bubbled in his throat. "You are becoming more a useless bastard day by day." Well, Jing couldn't blame him. Whenever they sent him into the hole to dig the ground on the other side, he climbed down it, only to meet Fulongquai. There he begged the old man to train him. The guards didn't know what went on the other side of the hole, but they did know that the digging was taking longer than it should have. Having no choice but to depend on him for the digging, they did what they could do best: help him to best use the power that was given to him and beat the hell out of him. "Just you wait," Jing thought as he pushed himself to his feet. "I'll get back at you for everything you're doing to me and all the innocent people in the mines."
"Look at the way he's glaring at us,"
one of the guards said, throwing his head back and laughing like the madman he was.
"Wish I could just pluck those eyeballs out."
The other guard smirked. His hungry eyes stayed on Jing's face a bit too long. Feeling disgusted, Jing dusted his clothes and started back for the mines and the hole. The familiar smell of rat droppings hit Jing's sinuses as he descended into the vast space. He stopped at the respectable distance from Fulongquai and studied the old man. His stick, now old and worn out, leaned against the stone wall beside him. He was meditating, eyes closed, the palms of his hands pressed against each other in front of his chest, and his only leg folded on the stone he sat on. "Do not trust him," Jing heard the words hissed into his ears, words uttered by the King Cobra, a Yaban animal that had promised to serve Jing as long as he got strong enough to command it. "I've told you countless times that this man is untrustworthy." "Why?" Jing shot back in his mind, and for a moment felt the snake recoil at his tone. "You tell me to steer clear of the old man, yet you don't tell me why. Need I remind you that he's the only one who can help me get strong enough to command you? Or do you not want me as your master?" Jing's words were met with silence. Satisfied, he waited for Fulongquai with his arms folded over his chest. "Well, how long will you pretend I'm not here?" Fu Lon Kuai opened his eyes just as an almost imperceptible smirk appeared on his face.
Becoming finished now, are we?
Train me. You're not going to beg me today? Won't get down on your knees? Rub your palms together? I'm done begging you. Jing spat as anger unfurled in his heart. I've been coming down here for a week after I woke up. A week after losing my mother, who died because of you. Yet you don't take responsibility for changing my life the way it has. The Cobra was meant to find you. I had no hand in that. But you have the ability to train me. So train me. I want to get out of this place. Fu Lon Kuai studied Jing for a moment, comparing him with the boy who first had fallen into his cave. Fine, we train. Jing smiled thinly at the hermit and nodded in acknowledgement. Just like that, his training began. Fu Lon Kuai was ruthless, and that much was expected of him. Jing started with meditation. For Fu Lon Kuai, his mind was too scattered to control something as powerful as a Yeben spirit, so he needed to control his emotions first. Jing was forced to sit closer to Fu Lon Kuai, within a reachable distance of his stick. Every day he stepped out of the hole with brand new marks from the hermit's sticks, for his mind had wandered, yet he didn't complain. Days started passing by in a blur. Jing worked in the mines after sunrise, and the guards shoved him down the hole in the afternoon after lunch. He welcomed it, as it was what he looked forward to. Every day, he came out long after the sun set, his body covered in bruises, which kept him up most of the night. Yet, he didn't give up. He didn't give in to his anger, exhaustion, and pain. He trained as Fu Lon Kuai asked him to. On some days, King Cobra whispered caution into his ears against the old hermit. But Jing didn't heed the warnings. He needed Fu Lon Kuai, he realized, and sometimes it was better to throw caution out of the window to get what you desired. During his meditation, whenever Jing closed his eyes, he fell into his consciousness, into another plane that was his mind. There, he faced King Cobra. The snake did everything it could to wear him down. He taunted him with his poisonous words to make him snap and attack him when he least expected him to. Jing didn't delude himself into thinking that King Cobra wanted the best for him. Deep down, he knew that the animal hated to be enslaved by a young boy who, in the Cobra's opinion, wasn't worth much. Jing intended to prove to the Cobra and Fu Lon Kuai that he deserved his powers and was the only person who could break out of the mines and out of the hell he'd lived his entire life. One day, Jing took longer than he usually did during the meditation. The Cobra had taunted him by making him recall Chen about how insignificant and weak he'd been, and how he couldn't save the one woman who mattered to him the most, how he'd been too weak to fight the poison in his body to be there for her when she needed him. She must have called his name and cried for him when the guards killed her. That was a sore spot for Jing, a swirling dark abyss of regret he knew he'd never be able to fill. Somehow, the Cobra's words, mixed with the exhaustion, made Jing snap. Cobra was delighted. Jing could feel it in the way air vibrated around him. If Cobra had anticipated that Jing would give up if hurt enough, it was wrong. Jing closed his eyes, sensing how the Cobra was curling around him. He recalled how the Cobra had moved, attacked, and tried to use his poisonous fangs. Then he moved his limbs with the fluidity of a snake, but with hands as hard and sharp as a dagger. A certain hiss filled the air around Jing, and he felt his senses heighten. It was Cobra style, Coup d'Iden, level 1. The style Cobra had been trying to teach him, though it wasn't a very good teacher. When he opened his eyes, his crescent tattoo was glowing, and his arms had glowing scales. Jing smiled as he sensed air particles throbbing around him. Cobra hissed in alarm as Jing turned to face him. He jumped. His body twisted as if it had no bones, and then he aimed for the Cobra's head with his hard hand in front of him, ready to strike. A loud thud echoed around Jing the moment Cobra's head hit the ground, with Jing on its massive head. "Never taunt me again like this," Jing growled and jumped off. Cobra stayed there where it was, head on the floor, as its red eyes followed Jing. Then soft laughter echoed from behind Jing. "Worthy indeed," Cobra said, raising its head. Then it lowered its head in respect. Jing turned, looking at the animal he shared his consciousness with, the one which gave him power, and now, at long last, he'd earned his respect. When Jing woke up from his consciousness, he looked down at his arms. Sure enough, his tattoo was still glowing, and the ghost of scales were visible. He looked up to find Fulon Kwai, reading him with an unreadable look on his face. "I did it," Jing said in a soft voice. "I used Coup d'Adin level 1. Fulon Kwai nodded. "You've just touched the tip of the iceberg. You have to master it. Learn to call upon it. Wield it whenever you want, not when you're pushed into the corner. Only after that will we move on to the next training phases. You'll have to learn different fighting styles and progress through the levels. Move like Cobra, strike like Cobra, and in simple words, be the Cobra." Jing nodded and stood up. "Tomorrow, then." When Jing stepped out of the hole, he found the mine cave vacant. He frowned as he looked in the discarded tools in heavy silence. "Where the heck is everyone?" he wondered. In response, he heard the Cobra hiss. Jing let himself smile, and it felt weird on his face after so long. He'd hurt Cobra's pride. Well, it can live with that. When Jing neared the mouth of the cave, he stopped short. There was a sound of laughter somewhere, followed by the sound of sobs. Frowning, Jing followed the sound. Two guards were talking to each other at the end of the cave, and at their feet lay two boys, younger than Jing. The boys had arrived at the camps a couple of days ago, and Jing hadn't seen them since.
"They're not as fun as the girl was,"
One of the guards was laughing, taking out a cigarette to smoke. The other took out the lighter and helped him light it. Inhaling the smoke, the first guard sat down and puffed out the smoke on one of the boys' faces. Shaking his head, Jing started to turn and leave them alone, but he stopped again. A flash of silver had caught his eye. Much to his horror, the first guard was holding a knife and was forcing the boy to open his mouth. There was a scream, followed by a shout of triumph. Jing didn't need the light to know that the guard had severed the tongue of one of the boys. Now he was waving it in the air, as if it were a trophy, while the boy was choking on the floor in his own blood. "What are you doing? Please stop," the other boy begged, his voice weak and wobbly. The other guard didn't let the first one celebrate alone. Whisking his own knife out his uniform, he kicked the other boy. Then he placed his boot on his throat before leaning down.
"Wrong, you say? What is right and what is wrong?"
The guard crooned.
"Maybe you tell me after I have your tongue."
Then the screams from the second boy echoed,
and Jing felt something snap in him for the second time in one day. This time, he didn't try to stop the power from running into his veins. Before he knew it, he was walking out of the corner he was hiding in. "Hey, sickheads!" Jing called the guards. They both stopped, dropped the tongues, and turned to him with their hands moving toward the guns at their belts. "Having fun?"
Which bastards are you?
The first guard shouted, pulling his gun out of his belt. Before loading it and training it on Jing, he was flying into the wall. Jing heard a satisfying crack of his skull before he turned to the second guard. Again, before the guard could shoot him, he slammed the heels of his hand into the guard's chest, sending him into the other wall. Even before the guard's body connected with the rough mine wall, Jing knew that he had shattered the guard's chest bones. When the guards lay there unmoving, he turned towards the two boys. They were crying in pain, their blood pooling beside them. "What have I done?" Jing said to himself, as he tried to help the first boy into a sitting position. Looking at him, he knew there was only so much he could do for them. There was no place to hide them. Wait, there was. "Listen to me," Jing said, cupping the boy's face. "I know a place where I can hide you, but you must be quiet, both of you." The boys were exceptionally brave, Jing realized, as he helped them through the dark mines and toward the hermit's hole. They held in the pain well and tried not to drop blood on the way. Once Jing had them climb through the hole, he followed them. Fulon Kwai greeted the trio with a frown.
What is going on?
He demanded in a cold, unimpressed voice. As the boys cowered before the old hermit, Jing moved forward and told him the whole story. At the end of it, Fulon Kwai was deep in thought. "Leave the boys here," he said at last. "I'll tend to them, teach them sign language, and train them to help you." "Help me?" Jing scoffed. "Help's a bit too expensive around here." "Boy," Fulon Kwai snarled, "you help them, and believe me when I say that they will return the favor." Jing shrugged and headed for the hole. He'd just taken a step when one of the boys rushed after him and latched onto his hand. Jing turned, taking in the boy's features and realizing that both of them looked the same. Twins. Brothers. "What?" Jing demanded of the boy, trying not to trace the blood that coated the threadbare dress he wore. The boy made wild gestures with his hands, his eyes desperate as if frustrated with himself that he couldn't say what he wanted to say. "If I'm not wrong, he's thanking you and asking if you'd be friends with him," Fulon Kwai told him with a satisfied smile. Jing let out an exasperated breath and then turned away without another word. Friend? He had a perverse desire to laugh at the concept. Friendships didn't exist in the mines, and he wasn't going to start one either. Over the next few days, the mystery of the dead guards and the disappearance of the two boys became a hot topic. It put the other guards and superiors at edge, so Jing dug the hole like he was supposed to. He could gain but a few moments alone with the hermit, and during those moments, he realized that the boys were fast learners. A certain coldness in their faces kept him at distance, but he couldn't deny that the boys were good at whatever Fulon Kwai taught them. Within a matter of days, they had learned most of the sign language and often laughed, gesticulating wildly at some jokes. Jing felt this desire taking root inside of him, desire to be included in those jokes. So he asked Fulon Kwai if he could also learn sign language, enough to understand what the boys said. With a satisfied smirk, the hermit agreed. Jing was more than happy to have a couple of friends to talk to. The young boys were the reason behind his cold heart's budding compassion and sympathy. The heart had turned dead when Chen died, and the only reason it had beaten for so long was because of the revenge that Jing sought. Now, everything was changing, and Jing only wondered how much of him would still change by the time he'd been done with the training. As Jing had come to learn, the twins were not as compassionate as he'd become. The way they talked about ripping out the guards' innards and stuffing them down their throats made Jing uneasy, but he never stopped them. The boys had suffered a lot more than he had, and these fantasies were all they used to keep themselves anchored. Though Jing wondered what the twins would do if unleashed onto the world outside and at the soldiers and other miners who had never helped them, he wished he'd never find out. Fu Lon Kuai was being very careful. He trained Jing separately because of the power that ran through his veins. While he taught the twins Buddha's fist, leading them to Buddha's palm, along with Tai Chi alongside, he focused on something different with Jing. After Jing had mastered some control over the Cobra, most of his training was on how to better wield that power. The training was brutal. Fu Lon Kuai could manipulate the energy around him. He shaped it into swords and flails. Most of the time, they left Jing bloody and bruised on the floor. Every failed attempt to dodge Fu Lon Kuai's attack resulted in his bones shattering. The unbearable pain blinded him and made him want to die, but he held on. For him, the shattering of bones and his skull cracking were less painful than the pain he'd felt when he'd lost Chen. The pain he had to visit and revisit during his training for Fu Lon Kuai, and the Cobra prodded his weakest point repeatedly. They made him see things that weren't there and never happened. They brought forth visions of formidable opponents who messed with his brain more than his body. But at the end of everything, there was Chen's face. The thought of her was what gave him the strength to stand on his feet after Fu Lon Kuai healed him. Sometimes he refused to. That's when her face became the push he needed to use his powers to heal himself now, only if he could use that push to attack Fu Lon Kuai. Jing could easily manipulate the energy in his consciousness and touch the Kudai Den fighting style. But the living world took more focus and mental power. In the real world, he constantly failed to use snake-style Kudai Den level 1. Jing focused on feeling the particles in the air like he'd felt in his mind, but his focus shattered every time Fu Lon Kuai's weapons materialized in the air. In addition to learning the snake style, he had other fighting skills he needed to master. He paid a high price for failing at them in front of Fu Lon Kuai. "Let go of your anger and your hatred," Cobra often whispered. "Let go of the things that make you human, and then you'll dissolve the threshold between your soul and your physical existence. Only then will you be able to become a powerful entity." Jing paid heed to the Cobra's advice. It took every bit of strength he possessed, sometimes even more, but he strived to get there, to become powerful enough to get out of there. Days passed and the seasons changed. The guards forgot all about the twins who were famous around the mines. Their own father had sold them. Jing learned during the days to feed his own desires. That's when he learned that most people weren't as lucky as he had been with Chen, only if he'd learned to appreciate what he had sooner. Jing and the twins didn't rest for a day. Over the years, the twins' resolve strengthened as Jing shared the cruelty he witnessed each day. The miners were turning into beasts and the guards into ruthless animals. At the slightest provocation, blood was drawn and heads were severed. It got worse and worse as Jing became stronger and stronger. 10 years later. "He's a show-off," one of the twins, Lon Fai, signed about Fu Lon Kuai. He's been saying for 10 years that he will let us out of this place."
"Well, I think he believes that we are not ready,"
Jing offered as they shared the meal he'd stolen from the guards earlier. He hadn't told the twins that he hadn't mastered the first level of snake fighting style in 10 years. He could tap into his powers and let them rush through his body, but he couldn't harden his hand enough to puncture a hole into the wall, nor could he make his body move with the fluidity of a snake. 10 years had passed, yet Jing didn't know how to master it enough for Fulong Kuai's liking or the Cobra's. "I doubt we'd ever be if we leave it up to him to decide," the other twin, Gong Fai, signed with a scoff. Jing gave the twins a faint smile and turned his head back to the old hermit who was meditating. 10 years had passed since Jing started coming into this cave for training. 10 years since Fulong Kuai had helped the twins learn various fighting styles. Jing had watched them grow, become men, but the coldness in their eyes hadn't diminished. The anger, frustration, and thirst for revenge still swirled in the depth of their eyes, and Jing still feared having them on the surface. He was afraid of unleashing them. During the training, they'd fought each other too, left each other half dead on the floor for the hermit to heal, but each fight and each hit had brought the three closer. Now they were a family. Years after Chen, Jing finally started to feel like he belonged. He also preferred to think that Fulong Kuai had also become attached to them, which was why he was afraid to let go of them. "Nah," Lon Fai signed again. "He doesn't care for us. Not the way you think he does. He's keeping us here for a reason."
"Probably for the right time,"
Jing offered, dusting his hands after his last bite.
"Precisely,"
Fulong Kuai's raspy voice echoed around them, and the three of them stood up, the half-burned sausages and cucumbers gone.
"Sorry we didn't leave any for you,"
Jing offered a faux apology, which Fulong Kuai waved off.
"It's time."
Jing shared a look with the twins as hope unfurled in his chest.
To escape."
"Huh?" Jing frowned, sharing another look with the twins, who shrugged, not believing the old man's words again.
"You're ready."
"Finally," Gong Fai signed. Fulong Kuai pressed his lips into a thin line as he regarded the three boys in front of him. Doubt swirled in Jing's heart, but he squashed it. If Fulong Kuai believed that he was ready, then he was.
"Yes, you have learned to wield your powers and control your moves, but it takes practice. For the last few years, that's what I wanted you to learn. Become experts by practicing, anchoring your strength, and bringing strength into your moves. Now, I believe you're ready."
"So how are we going to escape? Is there a plan?" Lon Fai asked. Fulong Kuai took a deep breath as his eyes hovered over the three.
"Yes, there is."
"Awesome," Gong Fai signed, slapping Jing and his twins back. His excitement was palatable, which made the other two grin back at him.
"Now listen to me very carefully,"
Fulong Kuai said, motioning for the boys to gather with him.
"There's only one bridge that will take you out of this island, but to get there, you have to be very careful. Plan everything carefully without leaving any loose ends. I don't want alarms blaring throughout the island."
"I'm listening," Jing responded. He couldn't have more blood on his hands than he already did over the past 10 years. He knew that he would be the one to clear the path and execute the plan because, for the miners, the twins had died 10 years ago. He preferred leaving quietly rather than raising an alarm that would end up in the deaths of many miners.
"There's a secret exit in the warden's office that leads you to the Froststone storage underground. If you make it to that storage, there won't be anyone who dare stop you. The warden's office? Do you mean the warden's office opposite the main gates, or the office he brought up near the camps where he takes women as he pleases? Jing asked, keeping the dark tone out of his voice. Fu Lon Kuai still caught on and shook his head. The main office, and you have to watch out for the anger in you. It refuses to go away. It'll only go away when I have the head of every guard in this place, but something tells me I cannot go out and start fighting. You'll lose. There are too many guards and they have guns. Anyone would run out of the energy that's required to cleanse the place of those vermin. Fu Lon Kuai agreed with exciting sympathy. I understand. Please continue. In that underground storage, they pack and ship the frost stones. The storage has two ways. The one in the west is the 12-mile-long bridge over the raging waters surrounding the island, and from under which warships pass every 30 minutes. The other way leads to the harbor, where the stones are loaded into the ships. The harbor is heavily guarded, even more than the mines here. I guess you're suggesting that we take the bridge. That's the only choice that you have. Beyond the bridge and on the mainland, look for the lotus that hides behind the shadow. Stay there and you'll be safe. What is the lotus that hides behind the shadow? Jing inquired. His question was met with Fu Lon Kuai's mysterious smirk. Jing felt uneasy, but he decided to move on. He didn't want to give up the opportunity by thinking too much. I'll figure it out when I get there, Jing thought. I've told you countless times not to trust this man, the Cobra warned him once again. In the 10 years that Jing had trained with Fu Lon Kuai and the Cobra, it hadn't stopped warning him. Now Jing rarely paid attention, but Fu Lon Kuai's words made him uneasy regardless. Then the bridge it is, Jing said, standing up to leave. Jing? Fu Lon Kuai called. At his voice, Jing turned to find 3 expectant faces gazing up at him. I get it, old man. I'll clear the path and come for the twins. That will be a waste of time. This has to be done at night, and it'll be better if the twins meet you at the cave entrance. Jing nodded and then turned to leave. On a thought, he stopped and faced the old hermit again. Why? I'm not sure what it is you ask. I'm sure that you do, Jing scoffed. I just want to know why you helped all 3 of us. What's in it for you? What do you gain from our escape? A little late to be asking that question, no? Fu Lon Kuai taunted in that annoying tone of his. Throwing up his hands, Jing started for the hole. Over the last 10 years, Jing had made the hole wide, but not wide enough for anyone else to pass through. It was shaped to fit his body and his alone. During the first year of training, the guards had waited for him to dig a bigger hole and pave a new path for the miners to mine in the cave, but Jing had lied. He told them the rock was hard up ahead and he couldn't dig it. They'd beaten him enough to make him bedridden for a week, but it'd been worth it, because after that, they'd left the hole alone and had taken mining in another direction. Jing didn't wait. He didn't waste a single night to escape, and when he had stepped out of his abode and spotted the twins hiding in the shadows of the caves, he smiled. He wasn't the only one desperate to get out of that hell, the one which had taken so much from them and had given them nothing in return. Around the mine, the guards increased during the nights, and this night was no exception. But 1 decade of uneventful nights had made the guards lazy.
They paid little to no attention to their surroundings and wasted their nights away gambling, drinking, or at poker. Their negligence increased the chances of the three men making it to the warden's main office. The warden's building was a rectangular, two-story structure with wide windows that overlooked the miners' camp. A wide and twisting staircase led to the main door's terrace. It was heavily guarded by more than 12 guards, all on alert, unlike the ones at the mines. "Do you want us to take care of them?" Gonfai signed. Jing closed his eyes, tried to calm his heartbeat, and then nodded. He had no idea what waited ahead of them, so he wanted to preserve his strength. Jing watched from the shadows as the twins crawled up the staircase from its side. They were like giant spiders, moving swiftly without making a sound. Jing held his breath as Lone Fai took hold of the first guard's foot and pulled. The guard couldn't even let out a little squeak as his body fell over the edge and onto the ground. The sound of his skull cracking echoed around Jing, but no one else heard it. After that, more bodies fell. Sounds of punches, soft curses, and surprise reached him, but no alarm was sounded. With each body that landed on the ground, dread curled around Jing's heart. The twins were ruthless indeed. They left their victims without eyeballs, intestines on display, or slashes across the entire body. Soon Gonfai appeared on the terrace and waved his hand to tell Jing that the path was clear. "Thanks, guys," Jing whispered to the twins as he climbed up the terrace and headed for the left window. He tested the lock, and it was unlocked. Apparently, luck was on their side. Unable to suppress the grin on his face, Jing pried the window open. The three jumped inside, the expensive carpet swallowing the sound of their footsteps. Before moving deeper into the house, Jing turned to look outside one last time. His eyes took in the bodies of the dead guards and the dark houses that stretched for a mile around the mountain that stood tall in the center of the island. The mountain he'd tried to climb when he'd been a teenager, and one he'd never been able to climb. He still wondered for a moment what the sight would have been like had he made it up to the top. In the end, his eyes came to rest on the house he shared with Chen and countless others. The place where she'd spent days tending to him eventually led to her life being taken. Lone Fai came back for him and tapped his shoulder, jerking his thoughts out of the past. Jing followed him. Warden's house was unlike anything Jing had ever seen. It was heavily decorated with curtains that shone in the lights from the lamps. The furniture was spotless and looked like it was expensive, more than their lives altogether. The decoration pieces were grand, made up of gold and diamond. Just how much was the warden earning from the mines? He wondered. Looking at the house, he realized why the warden went down to the mines instead of bringing women up here. He didn't want rumors about the home and extravagant lifestyle among the miners. Seeing all this made him sick down to his bones. He wished he could destroy it all in one sweep. He was capable of doing it anyway. The boys stopped outside the warden's office, the only door carved out of the rough, expensive wood. The twins signed, asking Jing if it was better to knock it down than to look for its key. Jing shook his head. They didn't have time. Lone Fai stepped back and bent his knees. He was going to use Buddha's palm, Jing realized. Within a blink of an eye, Lone Fai's palm connected with the door, and it fell with a loud bang that reverberated through the house. The boys shared a look and rushed inside. It didn't take them long to find the secret door that led to the underground storage area. Much to their surprise, it was left unlocked. Maybe it was because the warden believed no one would be able to make it into his office. Decades of peace had everyone careless, which played into their favor. Before heading down the tunnel on the other side of the secret door, Jing asked the twins to take care of the alarms. They were quieter and worked faster than he did. Nodding, they both disappeared into the house, leaving Jing alone in the warden's office with nothing but his thoughts. Jing went through Fu Lon Kuai's instructions again, and the prison break seemed surreal. This was a life-turning event, and he had no idea what the future had in store for him. He had the means to defend himself and fight the enemies, but he felt lonely. He was glad that the twins were with him and were his family, but he wondered how all three would change once they got out of there. There was too much anticipation and fear that churned in his heart. Soon the twins were back and took the lead as he entered the tunnel to the underground storage facility. Jing felt that someone would be coming after them soon, especially after the bodies they'd left on the terrace and the ground. The three of them were halfway down the tunnel when footsteps echoed behind them, the kind of footsteps that belonged to experienced soldiers, quiet and cautious. "One of you, go ahead, secure the path," Jing told the twins, and turned to face his opponents. Beside him, Lon Fai had decided to stay and fight, while Gon Fai ran ahead. Together they became ready to face the incoming soldiers in the dark of the tunnel. Slowly, the light emerged in front of them, followed by two soldiers. When their eyes landed on them, they stopped.
What do we have here?
The warden grinned, the light making his smile appear like that of a Cheshire.
A wayward miner. He's not just any miner, sir.
His second in command, whom Jing hadn't seen for a long time, added. "Good to see you too, Dong Guo," Jing grinned.
You two know him?
Warden asked, unappeased.
We had a chance of running into each other 10 years ago, sir. Then what are you waiting for now? Get rid of him!
The warden shouted. As Guo slid his sword out of the scabbard at his belt, Jing rolled his eyes. Before he could attack, Lon Fai moved from his side. Guo advanced toward Lon Fai with his sword, and Lon Fai didn't dodge until the last moment. Jing held his breath as he watched the blade narrowly missing Lon Fai. Guo let out a shout of frustration and turned on his feet. Once again, he brought down his sword on Lon Fai faster than Jing would have expected him to. This time, Lon Fai dodged the weapon, crouched and turned before using his palm to shift the blade upwards. Then he used his other palm to force the power downwards to Dong Guo's feet. Guo snarled before pushing himself upwards. His body rose high in the air and flipped over Lon Fai to evade the next attack. Guo landed behind Lon Fai with a satisfied smirk on his face, the smile that said the game was over and he had almost won. Jing held his breath, heart thudding in his chest, as he dared not intervene, despite every fiber of his body screaming to help his friend and brother. No one moved for a tense second, and Guo's smile dissolved into confusion as he looked down at the ground, the place where Lon Fai had directed his power before Guo had jumped. Guo staggered back a step as his sword slipped from his hands. It landed on the rough ground with a clang as Guo's hand flew toward his chest. He clawed at his clothes to bare his chest to see what had happened. Sure enough, a palm imprinted on his dark skin was the source of pain that had brought Guo to his knees. A slow smile formed on Jing's face as he realized what had happened. Lon Fai had used Buddha's fist and attacked Guo when he was not looking. Just like Jing had missed the twins' attack, Guo had never seen or felt Lon Fai's palm touch him. Guo fell with a surprised cry, choking out of his lips. When his body hit the ground with a thud, Jing turned to the warden, who had been watching the fight without batting an eye.
You're a brilliant fighter, boy. I'll give you that.
Warden's voice echoed in the silence that followed Guo's death. For some reason, the warden sounded delighted.
I see how you fought with my second in command. Surely you'd want to fight me too.
No, he won't fight you, Jing called out. Lon Fai looked at him, protest evident in his eyes. But Jing shook his head. He couldn't let him take on the warden who'd boasted with confidence that of a warrior. You can let me take his place, or you can pretend that you never saw us.
Some confidence you have, boy.
Warden spat at the insult Jing delivered him.
Let's see if it'll still be there after you're done fighting me.
The warden let out a howl of laughter, as if pleased by the way Jing talked back.
Tell me, boy, where have you been hiding in the mines all this time?
Why don't you ask your second in command? Jing replied mockingly. Oh, wait, you can't, because he's dead. The warden grinned menacingly. For some reason, the wildness in his eyes and the desire to shed blood reminded him of Gonfai. Jing shook his head and focused. The warden took out his sword, and Jing told Lon Fai to go after Gonfai. The twin tried to argue, but after one look at Jing's resolved face, he took off. He knew that it was Jing's fight to have. The heavy silence in Lon Fai's awareness was pierced with the sound of the warden drawing his sword. When he lunged toward Jing, he dodged the blade just as he had dodged Fulon Kuai's stick too many times. He turned and slammed his fist into the warden's back. To his surprise, the warden barely moved due to the impact.
Your fist is weak as a fawn on its legs.
The warden snickered, and he turned to face Jing again. This time, the warden was faster and more ruthless. His arms moved faster than Jing could track, and it left him with a number of cuts. Within minutes, Jing was bleeding, and the pain was making him lose focus. Deep down, Jing thought of what Fulon Kuai would have thought had he been there. He would have been so disappointed. Use my powers, Cobra's soft voice echoed in Jing's ears, making him smile. He closed his eyes and fell into his consciousness, where the Cobra was waiting for him. What do you mean by using you? Snake style. Kuda Din, level 1, Cobra replied and slithered close. You know I can only achieve that here, but not in the real world. You lack trust, my dear boy. Trust me, and let my raw power consume you. Only then will you be able to fight. What if I lose control? Jing asked, suddenly feeling tired of having this conversation over and over again. You won't. You're stronger than you'll give yourself credit for. Had you been a weak boy, I would have devoured you inside out, Cobra hissed. Jing pressed his lips in a thin line and pulled himself out to the present, where the warden was looking at him. An amused smile was dancing on his lips, which infuriated Jing even more. He couldn't help but wonder if that's how the warden smiled when he toyed with the women and hung miners for the ravens. I'm game, Jing whispered to the Cobra and closed his eyes. Suddenly, he felt hot. Too hot, as the Cobra's consciousness mingled with his own. The crescent tattoo on his forearm glowed just as the scales appeared under his skin. The warden let out a scream when he saw him like that. Instead of running away for his life, he raised his sword and charged. It was a pity that he was a good warrior, but not a good man. Jing moved his arms in a big circle before crossing them in front of him. Then he stretched his right hand in front of him, concentrating most of the snake's powers. His eyes were set on his opponent, who was close, too close. But he felt his arm harden and become pointed at the tip. When the warden swung his sword, Jing moved to the right with an agility of a snake, spun, and lodged his left arm into his heart. The warden's sword fell as his body jerked once. Blood burst out of his lips as he looked down at Jing's arm, elbow deep in his chest.
What the?
The warden couldn't complete his sentence before he went limp. Jing pulled back his hand and looked at the warden's heart in his hand. "It's done," he whispered to the cobra. With a satisfying hiss, the snake powers receded, and he was back to normal. He felt a strange satisfaction when he looked down at the warden's body at his feet. Laughter bubbled out of his chest as he looked at his bloodied hands. "I should have wiped the guards out in the mines like this," Jing said to himself. "One dead warden doesn't change anything." Just then, Lon Fai came up running at the exact time. He was carrying a bag full of supplies. He pulled at Jing's arm. "We have to go," he motioned wildly. Nodding, Jing let him guide him. Then all three of them entered the storage area. It was the place where the guards stored the frost stones. It was wide and spread under the island like a dark, never-ending abyss. There was condensing silence that hung in the air, making their rugged breaths sound louder than they were. "The door," Jing asked. Gonfai motioned towards their left with his head. Without wasting a second, they ran over to the door beyond which the bridge waited for them. When they reached it, Gonfai made wild gestures to get their attention. "I should also seal the door we came in from," he signed. "We can't have the soldiers following us on the bridge." Jing nodded and watched the twin disappear into the dark. Soon, the door leading to the 12-mile bridge was open. When Gonfai joined them, they stepped forward. "We can't walk on it because we'll be easy to spot and will be an easy target," Jing explained to the twins. Then he moved forward on his fours and started crawling under it. Grinning, the twins followed him. The first few minutes weren't hard for Jing, but as he crawled, his breathing became labored and his limbs started aching. His fight with the warden had left him exhausted. His stamina still needed a lot of work, and if he was to use snake style again, he didn't want to end up exhausted. Darkness swirled in the back of Jing's eyelids, and he fought the dizziness with all he had. "My powers can't help me here," he realized. This was his test of endurance, and he had no choice but to make it to the other end by himself. The twins were faster, and Jing couldn't help but appreciate their stamina. They crawled like spiders and had long since left him behind. Or so he thought. Below Jing, the waters were dark, and they churned in the harsh wind that blew around the island. In the camps, the tall walls protected them against the harsh winds, but here, Jing was exposed to it. It pushed Jing back and tried to pry his fingers off the wooden planks he clung to. It seemed as if the wind was trying to push him back to the island and away from the mainland. It seemed angry. Jing kept going, although it took twice longer than he anticipated. During that time, the warships passed by 3 times. Each time, the 3 of them pressed themselves against the rough planks and hoped that they wouldn't be spotted. Luck, it seemed, was on their side. Jing resisted the urge to shout with excitement when the mainland came closer. So close to freedom, he couldn't believe it. His smile died down on his lips when a piercing sound echoed from the island. All 3 of them stopped crawling and turned to look back the way they'd come from. Through the smoke over the waters, they saw red lights light up the night sky. "Our escape has been noticed," Jing cried, panic clear in his voice. The twins were no different as they looked at the mainland and then back on the island with their wide eyes. Now there was a certain urgency in their movements. Twice Jing thought he'd slip and end up at the depths of the ocean, but he held on. He was less than a half a mile away from the mainland when a bright light landed on them. The warships had spotted them. Jing let out a curse and urged the twins to move on, but they appeared to be struggling as well. The mainland seemed further and further away every time Jing looked up. "We're not going to make it," a dreadful thought heavily settled at the bottom of his stomach. "I can help you," Cobra's voice rang inside Jing's mind once more. Jing stopped moving. "How?" "I can lend you my powers again. More this time." "How can I be sure that you're not trying to take control? What if I end up so exhausted that I can't move on?" "Trust me, boy. You are my master, and it's my duty to serve you. You should take all the help you can get at this point." Clenching his jaw, Jing gave in to the Cobra. He closed his eyes and found himself standing in front of the Cobra. This time, the Cobra started slithering around in circles. Jing tried to focus on him, but he became dizzy as the Cobra moved faster and faster. Suddenly, the Cobra attacked him with his mouth wide. Jing had been so confused and dizzy that he couldn't stop the Cobra from swallowing him whole. Jing blinked, expecting darkness or a glimpse of the afterlife when he found himself standing on the bridge. The sirens were wailing, and some kind of announcement was being made by the warships. He ignored them all and stretched his arms at his insides. Immediately, the water started to move and then rose like a tsunami. The waves grew taller and taller till they became a towering wall over the warships. Jing heard cries of alarms just as the waves crashed down on them, sinking them. Before Jing could see what happened afterward, his legs gave out under him, and he fell onto the bridge flooring. Before his body could slide over the edge and fall into the waters, the twins jumped toward him. They caught him seconds before he could fall into the murky depths of the ocean below. It didn't take Jing long to regain his consciousness. He blinked against the starry night, and then blinked again when two familiar faces entered his line of vision. Gonfai signaled, grinning. "We thought you'd die." "Well," Jing said as he tried to sit up, "I thought that I died." In response, the twins said nothing, but sat down beside him. Together they looked back at the way they'd come from. The island was far away now, hidden on the other side of the fog that had settled over the waters. "Now we head to the lotus, which hides behind the shadows," Jing whispered. Lon Fai nudged to get his attention. When Jing looked at him, he found him making wild motions with his hands. "You want to change your names?" Jing couldn't believe what he was reading. Did the twins not like their names? Gonfai took a deep breath as if contemplating how to best explain what he wanted. Then he signed, "Now we're on the mainland. We want to be recognized not as the boys we were on the island, but as something more." "Oh yeah? What's that?" "We can't forget what we've been through," Lon Fai signed. "We won't rest till we've killed every man responsible for making our lives a living hell." Jing looked away as various emotions swirled inside him. Wasn't this what he wanted too? A quiet, semi-hysterical bark of laughter bubbled up from his chest as he looked at the kids again. "Then let's do it together. Punish the ruthless world and let the blood flow like water." The twins grinned as they told him about the new names they'd come up with. Lon Fai wanted to change his name to Buddha. Why? Lon Fai signaled that it was because the Buddha had brought him peace. Jing wanted to know how and when, but he didn't ask, respecting his privacy. He turned to Gonfai and asked what he wanted his name to be. With a wild emotion in his eyes, Gonfai signaled a word that sent a chill down Jing's spine. Gino, Jing whispered, from genocide, a fitting name for a fitting twin. The death and the pain he'd seen and suffered surely changed the perspective of this twin. At that moment, Jing knew that this boy would become a formidable force to be reckoned with in the future. He let out a breath that he didn't realize he was holding because he was glad to be on this boy's side. He only wondered what kind of fate he would have met had he been on the other side. The boys fell onto Jing for hugs. They clung to each other as they looked back at the island again. They had escaped the hell. Now it was only fitting that they get revenge for what they'd been through. It was only right that everyone who ruined them pay the price. The city behind them was quiet and sleeping, but the boys knew that it wouldn't be for long. They'd set foot on the land, and now the world was going to know all about them. The men responsible were going to pay the price in the most gruesome ways ever. They deserved what was coming to them. The twins and Jing were going to make sure that they became worse than the demons everyone feared. They were free. They had made it. The blood was going to spill, and the mainlands were going to learn the horrors of the island. The trio of them was going to be the face of nightmares. The trio was a nightmare. It was coming.